you understand how healing works? By understanding the process, we can not only heal ourselves, but understand why. Welcome to the Healing Power Hour with host Suzanne Hill. In our program, we will show you the healing modalities and approaches that you can use to heal yourself, no matter the illness or the symptoms. Now, here is your host, Suzanne Hill.
Hi, everybody. This is Suzanne Hill, and welcome back to the Healing Power Hour, which is broadcasting live from New York City today. Thank you for tuning in and demonstrating your commitment as a knowledge seeker in the area of health and healing. By the way, people seem to really like last week's show on the colon, so if you missed it, do be sure to download it as a podcast and listen when you can. For those of you who are new to the show, just to explain my approach to the program, in roughly the first third of every broadcast, I'll be doing a short teaching that will relate to the area of expertise of my guest that day. And then the remaining 2/3 of the show will be devoted to actually interviewing my guest, who today will be the incredibly articulate and knowledgeable Jeffrey M. Smith, world-renowned author on genetically modified foods. It's going to be a fascinating show, so stay tuned. Now, even though I have these amazing guests, the reason why I do take time to teach in the beginning is because I want to give you a reason to be deeply fascinated in the workings of your body. Facts are great, but there are plenty of you who are already quite well informed about the data, what you should be eating or not eating, what supplements you might want to be taking for your existing health condition, and so forth. But with all the knowledge that you have, that you've been accumulating in your brain data bank, you want to ask yourself, do you actually apply it? Or do you walk around, like I do as well, saying, yeah, I know I shouldn't eat genetically modified foods, but I'm not that diligent about keeping it entirely out of my diet. Or I know I really shouldn't eat sugar, but I kind of like it. Well, if you're one of those people, you're pretty much in the majority. But what I found in working with my patients is that data alone is usually not compelling enough for people to take action. There's not enough of a direct personal tie. So what do we do about that then? How do we motivate ourselves to make change? Well, I found that when I start to teach my patients about energy and the energetics behind things, that's when they get interested, and that's when they start making different choices in their lives. Somehow it becomes more personal to them, and that alone seems to create a deeper motivation to shift. And you know what? Learning about energy is not a complicated thing. It's actually rather simple and commonsensical. You just have to choose to see the world through that lens in the first place. So I incorporate energetic concepts throughout each broadcast in order for you to begin to understand and become fluent about energy, particularly as it relates to the human body. And that brings us to today's electrifying topic, genetically modified foods, also called genetically modified organisms or GMOs. GMOs is typically what you'll see in the paper or the online if you read about it. Now, as most of you know, genetically modified foods are those foods in which the DNA of a particular plant or animal has been altered for a very specific reason. Most often, for example, in a plant, to try and make it stronger or hardier in its growth cycle and therefore create a bigger harvest. While genetic modification of foods has been quietly going on since about the mid-1990s, many people today still don't know about it. And if they've heard of it, they don't know how widespread it is, or they don't realize how truly bad it is for them to eat these kinds of foods. See, if you only get your information about this topic through media, you might think that there isn't anything to be alarmed about. Why would our government allow the sale of food that makes us ill? Well, as an acupuncturist working with healing sick patients on an almost daily basis, the truth of that has surfaced on its own in my life about genetically modified foods that has been very hard to ignore. Because what I've observed as an acupuncture practitioner is that starting about 5 years ago, I began noticing that my patients were getting sicker. More and more people were coming in with gastrointestinal distress of unknown origin, and I was witnessing a greater amount of skin issues, skin-related issues, meaning skin rashes, eczema, hair loss, and so forth, which in Chinese medicine is intimately related to the colon and therefore relates back to food intake. And more people were also having food allergies, including my patients who did not historically have food allergies. In general, people's immune systems were not functioning as well as they should have been. Even when I took these patients off of wheat, sugar, gluten, and dairy, which are the standard triggers to those kinds of symptoms, these patients would improve somewhat, but they would never really totally heal. Whereas had it been 8 years ago or 10 years ago, those patients would have healed completely. So I started wondering if there was a shift in the food supply in this country, if there was a problem. Also around 5 years ago, I happened to have a big influx of European patients into my practice for whatever reason. These patients from France, Hungary, Bulgaria, and so forth, these patients in particular would experience health issues within months of moving into this country. Again, the gastrointestinal distress, the skin rashes, and the food allergies were highest on the list of their complaints. And they all said the same thing, that when they would go back to Europe for 2 or 3 weeks for vacation, all of their symptoms would greatly improve and maybe even disappear, even if they were eating things like bread and cheese every single day. But then they would come back to the United States, and wouldn't you know it, all of their symptoms would return. I had a patient just last month come to me for digestive issues. She's a 30-year-old woman in good health and no known pathology, meaning no other illness that she knew of in the body. And she, in the last year and a half, had been starting to experience perpetual bloating and gas, as well as alternating constipation and diarrhea. When I took her pulses did not reveal any significant energetic constraints, which was a little surprising to me. So I said to her, I wonder if it's not simply a problem of the food supply in this country. And I told her what I just told you about my European patients. And she said to me, you know, that's really interesting because a couple of months ago, I went to Australia on a 3-week assignment, and I was feeling so bad that I said, you know what the heck, I'm just going to eat whatever I want. I even ate burgers and fries. But over those 3 weeks, all my symptoms started to go away, only to return when she came back to the United States. So putting 2 and 2 together, I started investigating what exactly was going on with the food supply here in the United States. And the biggest thing I came across was the problem of genetically modified foods. Now, knowing what I know about energy and how it works, the whole concept of genetically modified foods is rather problematic. And I want to take you through why that is. So let's look at the energetics of food, because food is not just physical matter, it's also energy. Even a vitamin C capsule has energy emanating from it. Well, the first thing you want to know about food energy is that the more direct sun energy a food has, the more energy it has overall, and that energy will have a higher frequency. This is why wheatgrass juice, for example, is an incredibly healing food. It's loaded with sun energy. And that's also why people can't drink too much of it all at once. Even a shot glass can make some people feel like they've had a double espresso. It is so much energy that it can be hard for our systems to integrate. So green vegetables in particular, because they have a lot of chlorophyll used in photosynthesis, contain a lot of stored sun energy. Now, what you also want to know is that vegetables vibrate at a very different frequency than meats. Vegetables vibrate at a higher and finer frequency than meat, whether that meat is chicken, beef, or fish, or anything else, primarily because unlike vegetables, meat has less direct sun energy. So meat has a denser vibration. Well, why is this important for you to know? Because if you have an illness in the body, the organ or organ systems involved vibrate at a lower frequency than the rest of the body. And in order to heal the body, you've got to get that frequency up. This has all been proven, by the way. I'm not just making this stuff up. But that's why a lot of cancer patients, for example, find that they heal once they stop eating meat and start increasing their vegetable load. All that sun energy gives them more and more energy and increases their frequency. And this is, by the way, why Twinkies and all other processed foods are bad for you, because there is no sun energy in them. They actually bring your frequency down. They bring your energy down. Now, the next thing you want to know about food energy is that everything that happens to your food, from the original creation of that food till the time it makes its way to your plate, affects the energy of that food. And that includes how the seeds were created, how the food was planted and nurtured, how that food is harvested, and how that food is transported to you. It also includes how an animal is raised and slaughtered if we're talking about meat. This is why the American Indians had a practice of giving thanks and gratitude to the buffalo, for example, for sacrificing its life to feed them. That intentionality has a significant impact on the energy of the food. And the last thing you want to look at is, how is the food prepared? Does the chef have a happy heart or not? It makes a difference, actually. That's why when you're first in love with your partner and you cook together all the time, all the food that you make tastes pretty good because it's filled with lots of love energy. Again, I'm not kidding. And all this energy is cumulative. Finally, the last thing you want to know about food energy is that the seed of any plant and the egg of any animal contains an enormous amount of potential energy. The energy of whatever we want to create must be contained within the energy of that seed or of that egg. Most of it's contained in the DNA, actually. Seeds grow entire plants, and fertilized eggs grow entire animals. It's a pretty incredible process. So keeping in mind what we've just learned about the energetics of food, the question arises, is there an energetic problem with modifying food organisms at the DNA level, which is what we're doing when we genetically engineer food? Well, the biggest issue as I see it is that what happens when you genetically modify a living organism is that you're transplanting one kind of energy right smack dab in the middle of a wholly different kind of energy, particularly when you get into funky stuff like transplanting a gene from a fish onto the DNA of a strawberry. Frequency-wise, if you remember, a vegetable vibrates at a completely different energetic level than an animal. There's a reason why there's a vegetable kingdom and an animal kingdom, and it's not so easy to integrate those two very different frequencies. It would be like putting 6 bars of a Bach concerto right into the middle of a Lady Gaga song. It's not going to resonate harmoniously on any level. And remember that the DNA of any organism contains the entire blueprint for the growth and evolution of that organism. So when you transplant DNA, you're not only transplanting physical matter, you're also transplanting the history of the evolution of that organism. Energetically, this is why the product of genetic modification usually has a problem producing offspring, because the clash in energetic frequencies creates disharmony, and you need harmony to propagate healthy life. Another issue with genetically modified foods is that whenever you're involved in any act of creation, you are infusing your creation with a very specific intention. There's always a reason why we create what we create. Now, the reason that genetically modified food was created, at least what I can gather from my research, at best it was created because people truly thought we weren't going to be able to feed the food population without it. And at worst, it was created because people thought they could make a lot of money from it. We don't actually know what the true intention was, or at least I don't. But what we do know is that if the intention is coming from a fear that we can't feed the world without it, that is an energetically contractive intention. And if the intention is coming from greed, that's also an energetically contractive intention. Because that intention infuses the creation. When we eat genetically modified foods, we're either ingesting the energy of fear or we're ingesting the energy of greed, neither of which is pretty healthy. So where does that leave you, the consumer? Well, I'm hoping that your primary takeaway from today's show, particularly after you listen to Jeffrey Smith speak on the subject, is that you start to radically eliminate genetically modified foods from your diet, particularly if you have any kind of health issue. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's going to mean that you're going to have to start cooking at home more, Or if we can get enough people to demand it, restaurants may actually stop using genetically modified foods in the meals they serve. This, of course, means that you're going to, I'm going to, we're all going to have to start sharing this information with everybody, and I do mean everybody you know. So I hope that after listening to today's show, you'll be inspired to do that. And despite how dire it looks, I am an internal optimist, and I do think that we can make that happen, but we have to do it together. So that ends my portion of the show. We're going to go to commercial break, and when we return, I'll hopefully be talking with Jeffrey Smith, the author of Seeds of Deception and several other books. And he's also the creator of the DVD Genetic Roulette, a fascinating film about all the different areas in which genetically modified foods affect our lives. So please stay tuned, everybody. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Healing Power Hour. I'm Suzanne Hill, and I'd like to introduce my guest today, Jeffrey M. Smith, who is the author of the world-renowned book, The Seeds of Deception, which, as far as nonfiction books go, is a really compelling book, and I urge you all to read it, as it describes the whole history and process of genetically modified foods. Jeffrey's also created a highly informative and captivating video called Genetic Roulette, which I also encourage you all to watch. Hi, Jeffrey. Welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to be on our show today.
Great to be here.
So genetically modified foods is such a big topic that I'd love for you to start out by giving our listeners a few examples of genetically modified foods that we might be consuming unknowingly in the United States, and just to give a little background of what's been done to these foods and why.
Well, genetically engineered corn is engineered with genes from bacteria, and the genes either allow the corn to produce a toxic insecticide, which breaks open the stomach of insects to kill them, or it's engineered not to die when sprayed with an herbicide like Roundup. So you have Roundup-ready corn, and you have BT corn, which produces this BT toxin insecticide. Most of the GM crops, including soy and corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, is herbicide tolerant, meaning it's Roundup ready or can resist one or more different herbicides. So this whole business about GMOs is largely a way to make weeding easier for farmers. But the process of genetic engineering and the specific genes that they insert carry unpredicted side effects, and we're now seeing in the news, in the scientific literature, serious problems with these things for health and the environment.
So what, I see side effects that I don't know if you've listened to my part of the show, but I see more and more side effects, gastrointestinal stress and skin issues. Can you tell us what actually happens inside the body when someone consumes a genetically modified food? Do they know?
Well, it depends. I mean, there's many things. I just did a whole webinar for a doctor's organization yesterday called GMOs, Inflammation, and Autoimmune Disease. And we described how there are many different ways that GMOs could hurt the body. We do know that there are thousands of doctors who prescribe non-GMO diets to their patients, and they say that when their patients remove GMOs from their diet, they get better at a wide variety of things: gastrointestinal disorders, immune system problems, allergies, asthma, infertility, accelerated aging issues, and even behavioral problems and anxiety and depression. Now, when livestock are removed from GMOs and they go from GM soy to non-GM soy or GM corn to non-GM corn, they too have the same reported improvements. And for them, it's easier to identify GMOs as the causative agent because that's the only change in their diet is from GM to non-GM. If you look at the animal If you look at the animal feeding studies as the American Academy of Environmental Medicine has, they also identify that the lab animals exposed to GMOs suffer from the same disorders, including reproductive, gastrointestinal, immune organ damage, and accelerated aging.
So the infertility rates in our country should be on the increase if more and more people are eating genetically modified foods.
And that's exactly what's happening. The number of infertility clinics has skyrocketed, and we see, for example, rodents that were fed genetically modified soy. They had damage to the young sperm cells, they had damage to the uterus and ovaries, the DNA functioned differently in the embryo offspring. There was up to a 5-fold increase in infant mortality, smaller babies, sterile babies, and with hamsters by the 3rd generation, some had hair growing in their mouths. So we don't know if in this case, if it's the genetically engineered component of the crop or the fact that it contains large amounts of extra herbicide, which can disrupt the endocrine system and cause all sorts of hormonal changes. So it could be a combination of both.
So, of course, this all begs the question, how have GMO foods been able to be introduced into our population without the proper testing? How is that able to happen?
Well, this is a classic example of the companies controlling the regulators. The person in charge of policy at the FDA when the GMO policy was created was the former attorney to biotech giant Monsanto, later Monsanto's vice president, and now back at the FDA as the U.S. food safety czar. It turns out that the policy that he oversaw in 1992 stated that the agency wasn't aware of any information showing that GMOs were significantly different, and therefore not a single safety test was required by the FDA. Companies like Monsanto, who told us that PCBs, Agent Orange, and DDT were safe, can determine completely on their own that their GMOs are safe and put it on the market without having to tell the FDA. But the sentence in the policy which formed the excuse for this abominable policy was a lie. It turns out the agency was completely aware that GMOs were different. In fact, memos recovered because of a lawsuit show that the overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the FDA was exactly the opposite, that GMOs were different and dangerous.
And so what's going on with that now? Is anything happening as a result of this being discovered?
Well, what's happened is, as more and more research is done, and there's not a lot because the food companies or the biotech companies are not required to do extensive testing anywhere in the world, but nonetheless, the research that's coming out is so incriminating. For example, in September, research was done on rats-fed genetically engineered Roundup-ready corn, and the rats, up to 80% of the female rats developed tumors in the mammary glands. About up to 50% of the male rats had tumors, compared to about 20% in the control groups. The treated groups also died at 2 or 3 times the rate and had massive damage to their liver and kidneys and pituitary and whole endocrine system. And this was a 2-year study with rats. Now, normally the biotech industry only does 90-day studies, but in this 2-year study, the rats did not have tumors in the first 90 days. It was only in the next month that they started developing the tumors, conveniently after industry stopped doing their research. So what the industry has had to do is they've had to attack and try and distort and deny any evidence of harm. And they've had to do this consistently for 15 years as more and more research shows that GMOs are dangerous. And unfortunately, the FDA has been complicit in this, and they too are ignoring this now overwhelming evidence.
So what can we do as consumers? I mean, we other than how do we affect a change? We can affect it with our purchasing power, but what else can we do?
Well, fortunately, the market is very sensitive to GMO rejection. When the European press reported widely on a food scandal, when a gag order was lifted on a GMO researcher and he could finally tell the truth about why GMOs were so dangerous, that was back in February 1999. Within 10 weeks, the consumers were so educated about the concerns about GMOs that they had a tipping point of consumer rejection in April of that year. Virtually every major food company committed to stop using GM ingredients because they had become a marketing liability. In the United States, as we educated people about the cancer risks of milk from cows treated with genetically engineered bovine growth hormone, it too hit a tipping point. It was kicked out of Walmart's milk, Starbucks milk, Yoplait and Danone's yogurt, and most American dairies. Now we see the early signs of a tipping point against all GMOs surfacing in the United States, and we think only 5% of people avoiding GM ingredients in the brands that they choose would be sufficient to create a tipping point that would knock it out of the park. And we can help people avoid GMOs, and we do that by our shopping guide, which is at nongmoshoppingguide.com, with thousands of products that are verified by a third party as not containing genetically engineered ingredients.
So that's a website that listeners can go on to look up?
Right, nongmoshoppingguide.com, or if they have an iPhone or an iPad, they can download the free application Shop No GMO.
Oh, that's great. Now, I read that in March, Peru put a 10-year ban on genetically engineered food. How did that come about?
Well, I know that I submitted some information that was circulated in the government, but basically when governments are not, we could say, corrupted or biased by intense pressure from the biotech industry or the U.S. government, if they look at the actual research, they realize there's not a sufficient research to show safety and there's plenty of research to show harm. And that's not just in the level of health, but also the environment. And there's also strong economic reasons why a country should avoid using GMOs, because there's so much rejection of GMOs around the world that you actually reduce the export price of commodities when they're genetically engineered. Canada saw that with canola, but Australia didn't learn the lesson because the biotech industry swooped in and convinced a few politicians that using GMOs would save their industry. I toured the country and talked to some of those politicians and tried to convince them otherwise. They went ahead and approved genetically modified canola, and just as was predicted, the cost of the genetically engineered canola is now less, and the non-GM is commanding a premium because countries like Japan and regions like Europe do not want genetically engineered crops. So there's many countries that do not grow GMOs around the world.
Now, with the whole concept of cross-pollination, there's a big concern that if you have a field of genetically modified crops and it's near of crops that aren't genetically modified, that are organic, with wind blowing and cross-pollination, do you think that it will be that in 10 or 20 years' time, there won't be something that's truly organic?
Well, already we see a large amount of contamination, in fields that are adjacent to GM fields. And this is one reason why this third-party verifying organization called the Non-GMO Project has come about. Organic products are not allowed to intentionally use GMOs, but sometimes contamination occurs. If it does, it's usually a tiny amount. But the organic standards were created before GMOs were introduced, and they have no requirements for testing to see if contamination has occurred. The Non-GMO Project verification does require testing, and it has low thresholds so that if there is contamination, it's known to be tiny. So the issue is right now the corn genome, the corn gene pool is contaminated. You can get corn that's fully non-GMO, but you often get little trace amounts even in the non-GMO seeds that you buy. And this is one of the problems with GMOs, in that there is a self-propagating pollution of the gene pool, and we have no technology today to fully clean it up, but we know that we can dramatically reduce the exposure by eliminating GMOs from the marketplace.
Now, when you go around and talk to the farmers, in your DVD, Genetically Roulette, you showed interviews with pig farmers and cow farmers, and they clearly stated that once they stopped using the GMO corn to feed their herds, the health got better within weeks, if not days, and the mood of the animals were better. How much resistance is there still in the farming population that you've talked to buy the more expensive non-GMO corn and feed?
Well, there's a tremendous bias in the information given to the farmers in this country, especially those that grow corn and soybeans, because they get their information from the seed dealers, who are the biotech companies, the companies that sell them the pesticides, which are also, again, the biotech companies, the agricultural extension agents and land-grant universities that get their money and research agendas from the biotech companies, and even the farm radio and farm news is funded by advertising from the biotech company. So a lot of farmers get misinformation, and it's difficult to counter that because they've been getting that misinformation for more than a decade. Nonetheless, we're starting to see farmers realize the error of their ways because they can look at their neighbor's farm during the drought this past year, for example, and the non-GM corn and soy did much, much better, sometimes yielding 100 bushels more of corn because the water requirements are less for the natural corn and for the natural soy. Now, most farms in the Midwest no longer have livestock on the same farm. They grow corn or soy, and then they ship it off to places where livestock are concentrated. So it's difficult sometimes for someone growing it to see the impacts on their animals. But in cases where they do grow it themselves, they can see directly, and that's where we see the biggest dramatic results. They grow non-GM for a season, do a quick change, and within a couple of days, the health and behavior of the animals has changed.
Mm-hmm. The one thing that stuck out in my mind also in your movie Genetic Roulette is that, and I've seen this in my patients as well, is that if a patient eats genetically modified corn, for example, and they have health problems, skin reactions, gastrointestinal distress, allergies, and they stop eating the genetically modified corn, the symptoms will go away, but the problem is that they also can't eat the organic corn because now their body recognizes any kind of corn as an allergen and has a reaction. Have you talked to doctors about that as well? I mean, have they seen that?
Precisely the same thing. I talked to a doctor and I talked to a dietitian, and they're both in the film actually, and they describe how they need to take, like one said, they need to take a person off of all corn, not just the GM corn, and then after their body heals, they can introduce back the corn, and they won't react to it as long as it's not genetically modified. But there is this cross-reactivity. Once you stimulate the immune system to have a reaction, it can then become reactive to a variety of things that aren't necessarily the initial culprit. I was describing that in my presentation yesterday to the physicians, that the increase in allergies to food in the United States could easily be explained by the introduction of GMOs, even though the allergies aren't necessarily all to just the soy and corn. It could be to peanuts, it could be to other things, but it could sensitize the system to not only respond, in your case, as you said, to the non-GM corn, but also to other foods altogether.
Yeah, it can overreact to a whole host of things. Okay, well, we're going to thank you so much for sharing. We're going to have to go to break soon, but after break, we're going to follow up on more of this. Thank you, and also anything that you'd like to share that I don't ask, please help yourself to sharing with us as well. This is Suzanne Hill on the Healing Power Hour, talking with Jeffrey Smith, author of The Seeds of Deception. Thank you for listening. This is Suzanne Hill. I'm here with Jeffrey Smith, author of The Seeds of Deception and creator of the movie Genetic Roulette, all about genetically modified foods. And we're in our final part of the segment. And Jeffrey, you're there now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. So one of the questions I want to ask you is recently in California, there was a Proposition 37 that was meant to create mandatory labeling of genetically modified foods, and that did not pass. Can you give us a little background on what happened there?
Yes, it was a perfect example of the kind of deception tactics used by the biotech industry, which they've become expert at over the last 2 decades, completely misinforming and disinforming the public about the realities. They tried to paint Prop 37 as a ballot initiative that was created by trial lawyers to create shakedown lawsuits. It was actually inspired by a grandmother from Chico, California. They tried to claim that labeling GMOs would be very expensive, costing people more than $400 a year. It actually wouldn't have increased prices at all. They tried to say that there was special interest exemptions and that there was going to be hard on small farmers and on small businesses. All of that was a lie. And in spite of their over $1 million a day in a disinformation campaign, 48.5% of voters voted in favor of mandatory labeling. And in polls...
Oh, so close. So close.
I know. And we're trying it again now in Washington State. It'll be on the ballot in November. But also about 35 different states are going to be trying to get labeling bills passed through their legislatures. So this is one of the signs of the coming tipping point, that so many people are now activated because they're concerned about GMOs. They don't want to eat them. They don't want to have to use our shopping guide, and I don't blame them. They want them labeled like 61 other countries have.
Sure. I noticed on December 21st, when everybody was in the middle of celebrating their holiday, I saw a very small article that said that the FDA had approved the genetic engineering of salmon, even though they realized that the offspring was sterile. Can you comment on that?
Yes. Well, it was the next step towards approval. It wasn't the final approval. What they did is they approved the environmental assessment, and they did not take the recommendations of their own committee to do a full environmental impact statement. They just did this little thing and ignored 400,000 comments, 300 environmental and fishery organizations. They ignored basically good science in order to promote the industry. The salmon is now part of a comment period. You can find a action alert on our site at responsibletechnology.org. And we are trying to get the word out so people can not only respond to the FDA, but we're also going to be soon having an action alert where you can ask supermarkets to vow not to use these frankenfish.
Oh, now, that's great.
Yeah, the thing is about the fish, the company admits that the sterilization through the genetic engineering process is not ironclad, and that a certain percentage of these fish will in fact not be sterile, and it only takes one then to escape into the ocean and start reproducing to theoretically threaten the existence of natural salmon, because this frankenfish is equipped with genes that make them grow faster, and so they may outcompete the natural salmon, which could be a total disaster for all future generations.
Was there a problem in the salmon industry? Why did they need the salmon to grow faster?
They just wanted to send it to market quicker. So there was no problem that this solves. But also, the fish will likely be more allergenic, and it might also produce a hormone called IGF-1 in high amounts, which is linked to cancer. So there's a lot of reasons to avoid it, and the amount of research that's been done on it was so pathetic that even the people that were handpicked by the pro-Frankenfish FDA expressed concern over the lousy research that had been done by the company in its application.
So what's the next step for them if they're going to try to push it through? What do they have to do?
Well, the comment period ends towards the end of February. Then they're going to take time to review the comments, and then they can approve it on their own unless the Obama administration does something or Congress does something. Now, there are several Congress people, senators and congressmen, who come out with bills in support against the salmon, notably those from Alaska. And so there will also be an effort to get people to contact their representatives in Washington so that Congress can ban this ill-conceived genetically engineered animal. So we still have some wiggle room here, but it's very, very serious. It could actually pave the way for genetically engineering all livestock, which is actually on the drawing board of scientists and companies around the world. They essentially want to replace nature, and Monsanto's stated goal back in the early 90s and late 80s was to genetically engineer 100% of all commercial seeds in the world and patent it, and now that's expanded through the biotech industry to include all the animals as well.
Yeah, I remember in your book reading about a Monsanto ad that said there isn't much difference between foods made by Mother Nature and those made by man. What is artificial is a line drawn between them. Sounds like they're grasping for straws there.
They're amazing in their articulate lies. I was just talking yesterday that we just heard over the weekend a new research study came out showing that a genetic sequence that's inserted into almost all the genetically engineered crops on the market turns out to have a section that was never evaluated by regulators, and now that they looked at it, they says, oops, it might be producing, this little section might be producing proteins that could be toxic, that could dismantle the defenses against viral infection, that it could switch on other genes at random, pumping out allergens or carcinogens or toxins. And so it's really a serious issue, and there's a call around the world to get regulators to ban genetically modified crops. But this is just the latest in discoveries that their technology was so unready for prime time. It was so dangerous when it was introduced, and now every time they find a new allergen or a toxin or some problem, they do their best to cover it up. So the amount of clutter underneath their cover-up rug is so huge it's become a mountain, and it's inescapable for any independent observer.
So the next 60 days are really important. So I guess any listener to the show should really make an effort to write their congressperson, representative, whoever you need to write, to make an effort to express their discontent at what's going on with the genetic engineering of salmon. Because if you say if that passes and it opens the gateway to the genetic engineering of other livestock, then we're really all in trouble.
Absolutely. It's I would say the number one priority in the short term related to GMOs.
Yeah. Now, in your experience, you've been working with this about 10 plus years, or how long have you been working?
Since 1996. So you do the math.
It's probably almost right from the beginning. Now, how did you get into this work?
Well, I went to a lecture from a biotechnology scientist. He was a genetic engineer, and he was aware intimately that the technology was prone to unpredicted side effects. And he laid out in a scientific fashion why this stuff should never be introduced and exposed to the entire population in the food supply, and why it should never be released outdoors where it could never be recalled but would be part of our environment and ecosystem forever. And it was such a huge, unprecedented exposure of harm where it could affect all who eat and all living beings and all future generations. I realized people needed to hear about it. So in a quiet way, part-time, I started to speak about it and write brochures and letters. And then I worked at a GMO detection laboratory as the VP of marketing to get information out to the media and the public about what that lab was doing. And then I wrote Seeds of Deception in 2003, and it became the world's best-selling book on GMOs and has for the last 10 years. And that sort of put me on an international touring schedule where within the first year I was in 5 continents, and I haven't stopped.
Well, thank you so much for all your work, because it's helped me and it's helped a lot of my patients, and it's incredible information. My question for you is, in the last decade that you've been traveling, has anybody tried to discredit any of your work?
Oh, of course. This is the knee-jerk reaction. Any critic that comes out against GMOs is attacked, and I outline in my book, Genetic Roulette, the documented health risks of genetically engineered foods, about 10 standard ways that the biotech companies and their PR firms try to attack anything or anyone that would get in their way. And we don't pay much attention to it. It hasn't gotten much traction because what we do is very carefully documented evidence, and we put it out in a way that gets to millions and millions of people. So if they create a website or a statement, it just gets out to their own choir, which is very small. But we are dealing with a situation where they do have major control of the mainstream media in the United States, and so the amount of coverage in the United States has been pitiful compared to places like Europe. So people say to me, why are Europeans so concerned about GMOs? And the answer is because they know about it, and most Americans don't yet.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. So when you say that they have control of the media, can you explain to us exactly how that works?
Well, we know of a few ways. I mean, obviously there's interactions and relationships at board levels and things like that, which is sort of hard to see. But we know that when bovine growth hormone was being introduced by Monsanto, they had one PR company rate every reporter that did a report on it, whether they were favorable or unfavorable. Then another organization created by another of Monsanto's PR companies actually rewarded the reporters and news venues that did positive reports and threatened the ones that didn't. And in leaked memos, they describe how they were able to get the reporter for the New York Times reassigned to a different position. They described a whole scene that they had at USA Today when they tried to threaten the reporter in front of the editor. And we have a whole situation with bovine growth hormone that was going to be reported by a Fox TV affiliate in Florida, and they were going to spill the beans and link it to cancer, and 3 days before it was to air, threatening letters from Monsanto's attorney promising dire consequences to Fox and Rupert Murdoch ultimately canceled the series. So There's some very overt ways of control, and then there's some more subtle ways in terms of financial relationships.
Before we close, I want you also to address, in your book I read about the L-tryptophan issue, only to let listeners know that the genetic engineering just doesn't only have to do with food, it's also been introduced into the whole process of making medication. Can you talk about that a little?
Yes. What we have is a situation where genetic engineering is used to make viruses and used to make supplements and used to make a whole array of things. When I talk about viruses in terms of inoculations and vaccines. With L-tryptophan, they created this supplement which was used for stress and insomnia, etc., in the 1980s from bacteria that was genetically engineered to produce the tryptophan more economically. Now, the process of genetic engineering is fraught with unpredicted side effects and is almost certainly responsible for creating contaminants in the L-tryptophan that killed about 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick. It took 4 years to discover the epidemic, and it was almost missed. And it sort of is a case study or a lesson that if GMOs are in fact exacerbating inflammatory diseases, gastrointestinal diseases, immune system problems, infertility problems, it would be very, very difficult to identify it, because here was a situation with L-tryptophan where it was a completely new disease. It was unique. It had unique markers. It was standing out. It was acute. It came on quickly. It was practically screaming to be identified, and yet it took over 4 years, and it was almost missed.
To put the pieces together, right?
Exactly.
So before we close, I know that on your website, if you go to one of your websites, you can listeners can log on and watch your movie Genetic Roulette, and money is contributed. It's not a very expensive. It's something like $3 or something.
Yeah, $2.99, or actually, I think it's now for $1.99 on Amazon. You can rent it for a week, if I'm correct. They just got an email about that. In fact, it was awarded last week the 2012 Movie of the Year by the Solari Report. And it's something that, it's put out by the Institute, so it's actually a donation to the Institute in order to watch this film. And what we found is there's enough hard-hitting information in there so that most everyone who watches the film desires to change their diet on the spot. But it's not just gloom and doom. It does empower people, and it gives a very optimistic outlook for the future and ways that people can help.
Yeah, actually, that's the one thing I really loved about it. It doesn't leave you in a desperate place. It leaves on a positive note. In fact, it's on my list. I don't know if Michelle Obama has watched this video, but it's on my list to send one to the White House. So.
Oh, please do. I haven't sent one to the White House yet.
So I was going to send one to President Obama, and then my girlfriend said, no, Michelle's the one. She's the one that deals with all that.
Good idea.
So thank you so much, Jeffrey, for being on our show. To all our listeners, you've been listening to Jeffrey Smith, author of The Seeds of Deception and creator of the movie Genetic Roulette, all about genetically modified foods. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you, Jeffrey, again, for all your work. You definitely are one of the people who have changed the world, so thank you in a positive way.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care. And to all my listeners, as always, I say please make use of the knowledge that you have learned today. Take action, and much love to you all.
Thank you so much for joining us this week. Please join Suzanne Hill for another edition of the Healing Power Hour next Wednesday at 11 a.m. in the West, 2 p.m. in the East on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. Have a healthy week.